was the box they used for storing salt. But it almost looks like like a standard, a standard cape, except the one side of the roof stops a little bit earlier.
It's like a cape with a mullet.
Yeah.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, a weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anybody who cares deeply about the craft and science of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. Today I'm joined by Fine Homebuilding and GBA Editorial Director Andrew Zellner.
Morning, Patrick.
Operations Manager for TDS Custom Construction, Ian Schwant.
Hello.
And Producer Extraordinaire, Jeff Rose.
Hi there.
You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Please email your questions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. Well, as always, it's a pleasure to see you guys. Thanks for being here today.
Always happy to be here.
Always.
Andrew, what have you been working on around the homestead?
So we have a second floor on our house, and one of my projects for the winter is going to be replacing the floor up there. It's a mishmash of various floors at varying levels from the last 100 years, including some asbestos tiles, some sort of like significant humps in the floor that they're, I may open up this floor cavity and find out I'm not actually doing the floor this winter, and I'm doing a bunch of other stuff to my house. So I started kind of probing this project a little bit this weekend. So peeling up some layers of floor.
So homes like yours, which I think you could describe as kind of a bungalow, is that a fair description?
Yeah. Turn of the century, sort of craftsman-y kind of thing.
Oftentimes those were never meant to be living space, but this is living space currently?
Yeah. And I've got a gambrel style roof, so it is like a full. Inside we've got like 8-foot ceilings on the top, and it's 600 square feet of living space. So
how are you going to live without that living space for the time it takes to fix the floor?
So I have there's 3 bedrooms up there, one of which doesn't have anything in it. And so we're gonna play the furniture room shuffle a little bit.
What music do you play when you do that?
You just do it in silence and very quietly while your partner's out of the house. So the other sticking point here is Jill is an artist and illustrator and does shows throughout the summer. And there's and then as the winter approaches, the pre-holiday season is a big time as well. So that we actually went through the order of operations and what I was planning on doing, and there's a period between September 10th and November 1st where I'm not allowed to move Jill's studio anywhere in the house.
That seems like a pretty small window, given the rest of the year is available. Yeah.
One of the things I'm thinking about is how far I go, and if I'm going to be removing subfloor to even things out a little bit, level things. Do I start putting some insulation in between my floors? Because there's currently none, and you can hear the TV in our living room, in our bedroom above it, all that kind of stuff.
So is it board subflooring, or is it panels?
It's board. It's 1x4s, I think, 1x6s.
I think there's a good chance that your ceiling underneath will get damaged in this process of prying this up, right? I mean,
probably, yeah.
Cover up all the fruit bowls would be my suggestion. What do you think about this, Ian?
I think he's got a prime candidate for his partner yelling up to him, it's snowing downstairs. What are you doing? There's dust everywhere.
Yeah.
I think Patrick's
Jill's going to love this.
Cover the food up.
I think this is a super fun project, mainly because it's in your house, not mine. Wow. Okay. Well, I'll be curious to see how this all shakes out. How are you going to test the asbestos tile, or are you just going to assume it's toxic and take it out accordingly?
I'm going to assume it's toxic. Right now, there's like one closet has it in, and it was obviously also installed in the rest of the room, but it's no longer there. But they're 9x9 tiles from the 50s, and so like, if I was a betting man, I would bet they're asbestos.
Oh yeah, because all good things from the 50s have asbestos.
Yeah.
That's why they lasted so long.
Right. Jeff, what have you been working on?
Not a whole lot again. Just played in the shop a little. Did exciting things like sharpening knives and.
So, sharpening is on my mind lately. I have a collection of chainsaw chains that I've, either run in the dirt or hit rocks with or just wore out. And, my chainsaw dealer went out of business in June. They retired, so I had to find a new place. So I went to Newtown Power Equipment. And if you all are ever in the area and want to see some amazing kit for landscape maintenance and property maintenance, this is where you want to go. Because, for example, they have the more bark line of firewood processing equipment. And it's not fair to call it a log splitter. This thing is a tank made for, the biggest of logs. It had a log handler on there to pick up your huge pieces. I don't know what it cost, but it must have been tens of thousands of dollars. It was quite the rig. Skid steer loaders, amazing chainsaws, zero-turn mowers that look like they have 20 or 30 horsepower engines on it. Oh, this is the good stuff. I'm going to talk a little bit about my current conundrum, and then we're going to get to your conundrum, Ian, all right? And then we're going to talk more about that later. The new legislation meant to curb inflation, and it's meant to do a lot of things. I've heard folks describe it as a energy bill, right? Has incentives to put heat pumps in people's homes. And my heating system is at least decades old. It could be several decades old. And, it runs on oil. It's not especially efficient, quiet, or safe. So I'm thinking of putting in a central heat pump. And I think part of that is going to be new ductwork and the whole 9 yards. And, of course, the expense of this terrifies me. But I'm sure this is something that folks all over the country are going through. And I would love your thoughts on, does this make sense from a financial and planet perspective? And, I go back and forth spending what's going to be 10, 20 grand to make this switch over. Boy, it seems hard to justify. Imagine how much electric resistance heat you could buy for $20,000 as an example, right? So, folks, if you have thoughts on this, I'd love to hear.
Patrick, do you know what your spending on heating oil is annually?
So it's about 1 tank a year, Andrew. So depending on the price per gallon, it can be as little as, $400. That's not exactly fair because I think I spend, $75 a month on electricity to run the inefficient blower motor on the oil-fired furnace. So, it's less than $200 a month, I would say, or a year. Okay. No, that's a lie. It's it's less than $100 a month, and it's like $400 or $600 a year in fuel.
And you feel like you want to go with like a ducted approach with an air handler versus cassettes?
Once again, this is part of the conversation. Our house is ideally set up for a ducted mini split or more than one. It already has ductwork. I think on the supply side, it would be okay. I think the return side is undersized. It would need to be redone for a central system. Do we put 3 mini split heads in our 700 square foot house? For comfort, that's probably ideal. Liam likes his room like 60 degrees, so he really needs his own cassette or head. And, his room is tiny. Can you even get one small enough that, it's a conundrum.
So I've been thinking a lot about this too, and the other thing I think about is like I like to do a lot of work myself, and I feel like oftentimes for rebates, like you have to have the certified contractor doing the work, which increases the cost, and makes these projects less palatable. Although they like get installed in a matter of days or weeks, which never happens with my projects.
Or
So,
sometimes hours.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. These are all good points, and I'm guessing installing ductwork is not the huge expense of a heating system replacement, but it does take probably tens of hours of labor.
Are your
There's
walls?
also labor and engineering involved in designing that ductwork to make sure that it's sufficient for the system. That was a big driver in why we just put regular heads on the wall. And yeah, the one that's in my office here doesn't run very often, but it was less expensive for us than engineering ductwork into a structure that was never intended for having
Sure.
ductwork.
So my recollection, Ian, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that like the smallest head you can get is about 6,000 BTUs. Is that right?
That sounds right.
Yeah.
And that may be one of the cassettes, but I'm mostly just familiar with the Mitsubishi offerings.
What do you
Are
think
your-
about this, Jeff?
I'm intrigued because that's in my future at some point, but an order of magnitude or more.
Yeah.
Are your
you're-
walls plaster or drywall?
My walls are drywall, and my house was rehabbed about 10 years ago, poorly.
Okay.
So part of this equation is: do I do a deep energy retrofit to reduce the load? It's a very slippery slope,
Really
and this is why
Well,
people wait till their heating system fails and then they put in whatever was there, right? Because it's somewhat overwhelming.
Well, you're also in a position where you could do most of that deep energy retrofit work yourself. When you, as Andrew pointed out, have to hire somebody like the company I work for to do that, the costs
I could never afford it.
Quickly
Yeah.
get out of control.
Yeah, I could never afford it.
You could do what Dan Colber has talked about doing, a shallow energy retrofit. He hasn't spec'd out what that means yet, but I've heard him use that term a few times, probably as a joke.
Yeah, it's. I'm curious what that is. I mean, my house would require pulling off the vinyl siding and air sealing the sheathing layer because it's a very poor air barrier, I suspect. And if you go to that trouble, do you take out the windows because they're terrible? It's
Where do you stop?
where do you stop? Maybe I'll just get my chainsaws chain sharpened and go out in the woods. Cut more firewood. Ian, you have an even bigger project than this by a factor on your plate. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. First, I'll throw out there that Saturday morning last weekend, I got up and had a nice relaxing day planned for myself, and then my father-in-law called and told us he was ripping out his patio door and was going to fix the rotted hole in the floor of the dining room at their house that's been there for the entire 15 years Sarah and I have been together. So I got roped into Saturday and Sunday working with my in-laws and Sarah to rip out, replace the patio door, replace a pretty good sized chunk of rotted flooring and framing, and then laying new laminate floor in their kitchen. So
You
Just wanted
picked
to-
laminate because it's more waterproof than the
what
previous
they-
floor covering.
they picked that, and I think they picked it because it was heavily discounted.
So can I guess their door was leaking for a decade or more, right?
I think that for a very long time. And they live on a rather large lake in southern Wisconsin that they get weather coming across the lake, battering that side of the house. So I think once it started getting in under the door, it was over.
What's the fix for future rotted floors?
Well, I had a lot of very expensive flashing materials left over for my house. So on day 2 of the project, I took over a lot of zip stretch tape and some other stuff from Proclima that I had laying around, and we flashed it as best we could given the existing condition.
Do the American and European tapes play nicely together?
I've found that anything that has the pressure activated acrylic adhesive plays well together. I don't think they want you to know that.
So what's the big project coming up?
So after I got the shop set up in the garage and realized that was the most sensible spot to leave it because the garage is heated and has a concrete floor already, we took a second look at value engineering our giant shed project, and I went as far as to do a SketchUp rendering and add it to the model of our house. So on the after show, I'm going to have Patrick tell me all about why that's a terrible idea, and why it's too big and too tall and too red,
and why the roof is all wrong. Don't get me started. Yeah, it's what a fun project, and we'll get it straightened out. Don't worry.
Yeah, I know. I've talked about it before on here, and I had wanted to do kind of a half a barn dominium thing like Randy Williams was doing, but once I realized I could have the cost of the project by just leaving my shop where it is, it just didn't seem practical to spend all that money just to move the shop out of the garage.
Well, I look forward to talking more about that in the after show because it's looks like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Oh boy! As always, we heard from our fantastic listeners. This comes from Nat, who wanted to weigh in on our conversation about doing your own builds. He says, "Hey podcast, hope you had a nice week. I got to listen to the manual labor and dream house after shows, and as always, they were wonderful, both from an information and entertainment standpoint. A lot of great information in there that is certainly tangential to the owner-builder conversation. I know you didn't ask for it, and please feel free to ignore it, but here is what I would have liked to hear a couple of years ago when we started down the road of building our home. Here are the bullet points. 1, plan everything from the broad spectrum site planning to the minute details of air sealing and flashing. To insurance and financing, go in with a plan. It is easy to think that as the owner-builder, you will be immune to change orders, but they will still cost you time and money. 2, figure out your value add early on. Do you like manual labor? Are you a people person with management skills? What is your hard skill set? What are your soft skills? What do you enjoy? How can you avoid burnout? 3.
You can't. That's the answer.
You can't. 3, it is going to take longer than expected, even if you plan for it taking longer than expected, especially if it's your first time. That I cannot agree with more. 4, it will probably cost more money than expected. That I agree even more. Consider the cost on your lifestyle and your relationships. This could be the best experience of your life or the worst, or more likely a roller coaster ride in between. I will leave it at that and also apologize for the unsolicited suggestions. Did you come up with any ideas for best practice floor reclamation? Yeah, we answered that last week, right? So,
yep.
Nat's going to get the oak flooring from that abandoned building. What do you think of his list of suggestions for, keeping sanity in your own build?
I really like the idea of figuring out your value add early. It's almost like the idea of like spending your money smartly. If you're not the manual labor person, you can pay other people to do manual labor and your life will be way better.
It's funny, I talked a little bit about this to Brian Pontalillo, but I don't know if I did with you guys. When I was doing my house build in Stowe, and the barn build here to a lesser extent, you always think like, once I get through this one stage, it's going to be so much easier, and then it's going to, it's going to click, and it's going to be better, and then it's wrong. It's never easier.
Yeah, I did a piece for the Fine Homebuilding house stuff that I did with my build where I talked about like why I chose to pay a roofer to install the roofing on my house and things like that. And
Because
it
people
is
say
part of
that's
the value
easy. Why
add.
don't you do that yourself, right? And the answer is
The answer is it's also cheap to pay
Yeah.
somebody else to do it in the grand scheme of things.
and they
So-
do it in a day instead of
And they-
you doing
and
it
they
over
do
a
it
period
in
of
a day.
weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was adding weeks to my availability at a pretty low cost. There was a few other things like that too in my build that I covered in that piece.
Well, Nat, thanks for that thoughts on your own build. I think that's good stuff. This is from Patrick. You guys may remember Patrick had a question on replacing his Federal Mogul electrical panel. We suggested he just get rid of that thing. Thanks again for the airtime last week, and if possible, email me back with your new response after seeing this estimate. Question, would the fact that I have wires in the crawl space and attic going to this sub panel make the price more expensive? I guess it would. It's been like pulling teeth to get an electrician out to our house, so I feel like I want to go with these guys and not worry about another estimate. Also, our usual electric company recently quit doing residential work and now does apartments and new commercial only. What a bummer. I honestly have no clue if this seems high. Thanks again for your time and knowledge, Patrick. So did you guys have a chance to look at Patrick's electrical estimate?
I did. I found it very interesting, and I actually went on the website of the company that came and gave him the estimate and was pretty impressed with the overall professionalism on the website. And they have a stated code of ethics on there that goes into not
It was
just
enough that it moved you enough to say that you would hire them implicitly. Am I
absolutely.
right?
Yeah, definitely.
What
And-
was it?
Well, hopefully this goes well and we can give this company a shout out on a future one. So Patrick's got to keep us in the know on how this company works out for him. But my suggestion to Patrick would be to expect a really high level of professionalism from this company, because that's what they're putting out there in terms of their estimate and their website and all of their marketing materials, and to be an active participant in the project, ask questions like what he's asking us and find out what's behind the added cost. One of the things that jumped out at me on their website was they explicitly say we charge by the job, not by the hour. So that to me is telling somebody like Patrick, you had better be 100% thrilled with the job that they do, because that's what you're purchasing from them. You're not purchasing an hour of an electrician's time. So go into it knowing that.
My takeaway from this was I should have been an electrician, which I've thought many times in my life. Andrew, it seemed fair to you?
It did seem fair. Maybe a little on the high end, but when you mention wires in the crawl space and attic, somebody's going to have to go into both of those spaces, and that's going to take time, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and that's worth paying for. For sure.
Knowing that too, I suspect there's a sneaky high amount of material that's going to get used in this executing, getting rid of that panel, and the junction boxes that they're going to have to do. All that wiring comes at a pretty high cost right now.
Are they? And it's there. So they're removing the Federal Pacific as a sub panel, and then they're running everything back to the new panel or the existing panel.
I thought they were going to
my
put.
understanding.
I thought they were going to put a new panel there and use junction boxes to connect wires that didn't have enough length to stretch to the new panel, but.
That was my biggest question. Is it just in the estimate? It just talked about removal, and I don't think it
Right.
talked about replacing that panel. So that would be something to clarify for sure.
Jeff, you got any thoughts on this?
Well, no, I think based on the original question from Patrick, and I think there's a second existing panel that they're running everything to.
That was my take on it as well.
Yeah, and then adding the surge suppressor and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of sticker shock there, but I think it's probably deserved.
Just write the check, Patrick. Get on with it.
I think it's easy to think about this in terms of like a service upgrade, where it would just be pulling out the old service, installing a new one, which is typically about half to 2/3 the price that Patrick was given. But he has a very different set of existing conditions there that have to be dealt with. I would also think that he could have that company come back out and explain what they are, what they're pricing in that estimate too.
The other thing, so replacing my panel has been on my mind, and there is some money in the Inflation Reduction Act to go toward that.
Heat pump water heater too, right? You're going to do that?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for the follow-up, Patrick. I think you should, if you feel comfortable with this company, and Ian certainly does, get the work done. This is bad. Somebody pointed out in the YouTube comments that these panels don't trip in an overcurrent condition, and that's really dangerous. That's how fires start. This comes from Mario. He says, now in Newfoundland. Hey guys, I grew up in British Columbia in the 90s and recall a huge leaky condo issue in the Vancouver area, which led to the government to implement a lot of red tape to the industry, mainly an expensive insurance program for contractors doing new builds, ostensibly to cover problems down the road, but actually it only paid for the bureaucracy. As a new apprentice, I framed one house where the client agreed to be the contractor to get around the multi-$1,000 expense my boss would have had to pay for the privilege of being the contractor. My suspicion is the self-builder testing came about as many people were using the same workaround. Now in Newfoundland, Mario, what do you think? They came up with the test to prevent people from acting as their own GC to save the expense of hiring a real GC?
Could be.
Any other Canadians have thoughts on this? Would love to hear that. It's hard for me to believe that a bureaucracy would want to make a program.
and a test? That doesn't make any sense.
This comes from Mark. Hey, podcast. In show 483, you discussed basement ceiling options in the context of maintaining access to junction boxes and utilities. I have a solution that maintains utility access that has worked well for me. I mounted gypsum panels in between the floor joists using cleats. I placed acoustic high-density insulation above the gypsum panels to help control sound transmission through the ceiling/floor. I used exposed spiral ductwork, which complements the industrial look of the space. The utilities, joist, and panels are all painted the same color. I've been here 2 years now with no issues of dust or spider webs in the joist cavities. I have access above the panels to run wires for speakers, power, and lighting as needed. I've enclosed a few photos of the finished basement. I'm not a fan of acoustic tile ceilings, and gypsum ceilings would have made future access difficult and made the space tighter with soffits and lots of access panels. The industrial light over the pool table is my latest project. I built it from scratch based on a lights fixture I saw online. Love the podcast. Mark. This is from Mark Jassome, our HVAC debunker, and he signs as HVAC myth debunker and DIYer. What do you guys think of his basement space? This is
pretty cool.
It's
looks
the coolest
awesome.
space. Yeah. I would totally do the spiral duct in my living space if I thought a future home buyer might think it was just the most hideous thing they've ever seen. But
Yeah.
that's so cool, and it seems so darn practical. What about the light fixture?
Not my taste, but pretty cool
yeah.
if you can do that yourself.
It looks like there's a lot of visual weight and actual weight in that light fixture.
Yes.
All I can say is this came from the mind of an engineer, right?
Yeah.
What do you guys think about the putting up gypsum in between your floor system?
Sounds super easy.
Does it sound easier than running it over the whole ceiling?
No, I'm joking. I think it sounds terrible. Cutting and fitting every individual piece of ceiling in there. Oh my gosh. Yeah, I don't know. It looks awesome. And if it's all labor, right? There's no material cost that's different than a drywall ceiling. Looks fantastic. I think, Mark is hardcore, without question. I think this would take a lot of time.
It's
Looks
got a
great, though.
great basement rec room look to it. Somewhere bridging that gap between residential basement and like Buffalo Wild Wings or something like that.
Mark's, 9 to 5 is working in like hospitals and institutional spaces, designing the HVAC system. So I'm sure he has a comfort with that aesthetic, right?
Yeah.
What do you think, Jeff? You've been working on your basement for decades now. Is this something you've thought about doing?
No, that would not be my idea of a good time.
Well, we better get to some questions. This comes from Kevin. Here's my question regarding ADU design. We moved to Vermont a few years ago. Our family is not in New England. Our parents are retired, and they want to stay for longer visits and spend time with the grandkids. They also want a little privacy and comfort when they're here. My wife and I are planning a mother-in-law suite over the garage. This would provide us with more vehicle/tool/machine space and an above area for our guests. 1, the building is planned to be a simple Cape style with a shed dormer. From what I see, pretty standard. My wife hates shed dormers. Any ideas for simple designs that don't include a shed dormer? Also, with aging parents, any ideas on making the accessibility better than an interior or exterior stairway? So I think we should tackle these one at a time, because sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think about like what part of the question we never answered in our discussion. What do you do if you don't want a shed dormer?
I think it's a tough one here. My feeling is that he might be way overthinking it and making it more expensive. Just either put a half second story above the garage or put a full second story with full height walls, and just put a simple gable roof on it.
Andrew, Jeff?
My mind went to the salt box as
there
a
we
potential
go.
option.
Yep.
Yeah. So do you want to describe that briefly for folks who might not be familiar with that architectural form?
It looks
Well,
like
if
a
you're-
giant shed dormer.
Yeah. If you're not familiar what a salt box from the 1700s looks like, was the box they used for storing salt. But it almost looks like like a standard, a standard cape, except the one side of the roof stops a little bit earlier.
It's like a cape with a mullet.
Yeah. And so I was actually, I'm always thinking about an ADU, and I had an epiphany that the salt box would be a really good option for somebody who can position it where the long side of the roof would also get a bunch of solar.
Ooh, yeah. Put panels on there.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's a huge expanse of flat roof. You could even design it so it's at the exact right angle for your place in the world to get solar energy from.
What about accessibility?
I think for accessibility, you either do a home elevator, which they continue to come down in price, or you do the commercial code for stairways, which would be a 6-inch rise and a deeper tread, which is what I did for the stairs in my house, and it makes a pretty sizable difference.
I like the elevator. I mean, even shallow steps are steps, right? And if you're, severely mobility impaired, steps are bad.
I would check out the elevator because they're less money than you think that they would be in the grand scheme of things.
And you can get those like garage lifts things from Harbor Freight even more inexpensively, and I'm sure you could rig that up to haul yourself upstairs if you wanted. No, don't do that.
A powered dumbwaiter.
The other thing I was going to say is just because in your mind right now you're thinking garage on the first level and living space on the second level, you could have half of that first level space be living space. Like you could divide your building in half vertically.
It's a good point.
If that's truly a concern, like just because garage, like the general consensus is garage on the first floor, living space on the second floor. Think about it as like a side by side building.
You
I
could
kind
do
of
it.
like this
You could do it
spitballing
extra
because
depth.
Yeah.
that's what I'm thinking. Just make it all in one level, right? Have a
Yep.
garage and an apartment in the back of the building,
And there's nothing
Easier to
stopping
build,
you
too.
from doing a double deep garage where you would just park two cars the long way,
right?
one in front
Yeah.
of the other.
I would revisit the shed dormer too because I think shed dormers look awesome,
Especially big greedy ones that go across the whole width of the house.
I understand the garage space and ADU need to have a solid air and fire barrier between them for safety reasons. With 2 leaky garage doors, is there a reason to go crazy on the garage portion insulation? Can I do 2x4 construction on the garage portion and then switch to 2x6 on the gable ends of the living space? Can I put rigid insulation between the bottom of the joist and drywall? I think this is a good chance to remind folks of one of the principles of building science is that like your assemblies are only as good as the worst of them. So it doesn't matter if you put 2x6 walls. I mean, it matters a little, but it's not enough to move the needle, right?
Correct.
So, and you definitely need a good air barrier and fire separation for these 2 spaces for obvious reasons. So,
I think this gets to some of the things we talked about. I believe Kylie was on with us when somebody had written in about basement garage space and what they needed to do for the separation between that basement garage and the living area above.
did it sound like we knew what we were talking about in that conversation, as you recall?
As I recall, we sounded very confident.
Yeah, we nailed it.
I was hoping to avoid some sheathing, issue 309 by Fernando Ruiz. Fernando had a feature recently that described omitting solid sheathing to save money and provide a more comfortable home. On a 2-story structure like this, that's going to be tough, especially with large, they call them portal openings, garage door openings. You need that sheathing to prevent the building from racking, right? Because you have these huge spaces that are interrupting what would be otherwise a plywood panel to resist racking. I don't know if I would experiment with that too much here in a garage. He says, I'm planning to cathedral ceiling with I-joist rafters, vented using baffles, and insulate with cellulose. I think that's fine. I think it's easier to put, exterior insulation on the top side and fill them solid with cellulose than trying to create the vent space. But I think either would work.
I was surprised by this, that it seems to me the easiest way to execute this with a second story would be just to get some kind of truss with an attic room built into it.
Can you do real floor loads with those, Ian? My understanding was they were pretty light and meant for storage.
I think you can do real floor loads with them. You just end up with a 2x8 bottom cord.
And if you have a center girder below, it's,
Right.
You could go pretty heavy, right?
Yeah.
You could have pretty heavy floor loads. There's room to play with exterior grade. Is a frost-protected shallow foundation doable? I can ramp the grade for the garage entry, but also want to keep the grade down around the rest of the building. Or is it better to do a traditional footer that keeps the garage slab 8 inches below the walls? If you have a flat site, I think a frost-protected shallow foundation is an awesome way to go.
Yep.
And Andy Engel did this very build for a book he did for Taunton. But you have to have the right topography to make that work, or it gets pretty expensive to bring in the fill, right, Ian?
Yep.
I don't know if we were any help with this. I would say think one story. It solves a bunch of your problems, and use a gabled truss, fill it with cellulose, and have two stories and an elevator.
So I think we'll get into
eliminate
this
the elevator.
more. We'll get into this more on the after show, but I think the writer is at that point in a self-designed and executed project where he might be approaching it from the if money and time were no object perspective. And he may have several runs of value engineering to do to this project before it lands on the I can actually execute this without killing myself.
Or going broke, right?
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
As you pointed out in an email last night, you don't want to be eating ramen for the next few years, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, the 25-cent top ramen from Aldi's or your discount grocer of choice.
Aldi has that in bulk quantities, right?
Yep.
Dave writes in, "Hey podcast, love the podcast and the topics you cover. I was able to salvage about 100 pieces of 2-inch thick paper-faced polyiso insulation. I'd like to fasten this to the exterior of my barn for insulation, but I'm concerned that the paper face will mold. What do you think? The planned assembly would be 2x4 studs, 5/8 inch thick plywood, 2 inches of rigid paper-faced polyiso, a WRB, furring to create an air gap, vertical rough sawn board-and-batten siding. My thought is that the WRB would stop moisture from getting to the paper-faced polyiso and prevent it from getting moldy, but would love to hear what you think. Thanks for any insight, Dave." This seems like a pretty easy one. Who wants to go with this?
The first question I had for you, Patrick, is I've never seen paper-faced polyiso, but I have seen fiberglass-based polyiso, which kind of feels like a paper, at least when you're demoing it. Is this what he's talking about, or have you seen an actual paper-faced product?
I want to say I have seen a paper-faced polyiso insulation. It seems like what I recollect is kind of like craft paper.
Okay.
And there's definitely like roofing products that have a very thick kind of papery, fibrous coating on them. So in either case, I'm guessing it's not supposed to get wet.
Right.
But I think if you have a good WRB and, maybe it's too expensive, but like a self-adhered one would seem like the safest to me. But I think you could make, a normal one work with some conscientious installation, and I would stay away from anything that's, perforated or, woven. I would go with a non-woven, pretty water-resistive version.
So in my research, it looks like this is polyiso commonly used for commercial roofing.
Yeah.
What do they cover it with?
Rubber or PVC. You know what I mean?
Okay.
These are membrane, watertight roofs. It's not like a shingle roof, which is water shedding, right? It's not really watertight. These things are like a bathtub done correctly. So, you have an airspace you're planning on, Dave. That makes it way more forgiving. And, lap your stuff correctly. And I don't see a problem with it, especially if you got good overhangs on your building. That makes things way more resilient. What am I forgetting, folks?
I think you got it.
Put a fork in it. We got that one out of the way. This one comes from Mark. "Hello, podcast crew. Love the show. Thanks for everything you guys do. I have 2 questions. My house is a 1952 ranch built very simply. It has a basement. My main floor has some unevenness to it in some areas right next to where the main floor beam runs down the center of the house under the floor. The floor joists that attach to it are done so with an older method. There's a ledger strip under each joist and a 2x2 notch cut out on the bottom of the joist end. Some of the joists have some separation, and I suspect that if I tighten the connection back up and fortify it, I can straighten my floors out to an extent. Obviously, the wood is shrunken / shifted away over the years. What do you think the best course of action would be? I could either remove the ledger strip and install joist hangers, or get some nice big truss screws, ledger lock, truss lock, and run them up through the joist into the girder it hangs from. Otherwise, the joist seems to have a few toenails. If I remove the ledger strip, I'd have an issue still with the joist hanger and the notch under the joist where the ledger strip was. We'll get to his second question here after we deal with this. What do you guys think? So to explain this, he's got a little, what looks like 1x2 piece of lumber nailed to the side of the main girder that the floor joists rest on, and that's transferring the load from the end of the floor joist to the beam.
My feeling is to use hangers. I think he could just remove the ledger in sections, use a beefier hanger like something from the Simpson HUS series, which has they call it a double shear nailing pattern. So it has a wider flange that would get attached to his header that the cleat is attached to right now. And then I would use screws, structural screws for that instead of nails. And he could actually use a straight edge then and work one joist at a time and straighten out the floor and screw them in place with the hanger. And those particular hangers have a much deeper pocket on the bottom. So I think
if there's some separation between the joist end and the beam, it's not as big a deal. Yeah.
It's not as big of a deal, and it's got more screw purchase on the hanger body. So I would use something heavy duty like that.
I think we should figure out a way to say screw purchase in every conversation we have. I think a telepost, one of those telescopic jacks used for either temporary or permanently supporting a beam, would be ideal for, tweaking your floor joists up and down.
Yeah, I think it'd be really easy with a laser or just a simple straight edge. Go to a lumber yard and get a good straight 16-footer and put it across your floor and chip away at it.
I think it's, 52 is probably when we started getting into more standardized lumber, but, prior to World War II, floor joists often varied a little bit in size, so you can't necessarily, set them all the same height in the basement because they probably vary in depth a little, so you have to tweak it from the top side, but
right. So
Mark probably will be able to tell that if he measures them and they're all the same, he doesn't have to worry about it.
Right. So when this was built, the carpenter that did it just measured a set distance down from what they determined to be the top of the joist and made that notch cut.
And made it different depending on how deep it was. Yeah. Sounds like a piece of cake, Mark. Don't worry. Oh, Ian suggested screws for these hangers. I think this is a great opportunity to buy a palm nailer if you don't have one, and you'll love it.
Why stop at that? Just get a metal connector nail gun.
Yeah, I mean, what a fantastic tool. Some tools just are so amazing in the amount of labor they save, and that's one of them.
Yes, Sarah did all the hangers in our house with a metal connector gun that we have.
If there are any pros who listen to this show who don't yet have one, and it would be hard for me to believe there are, get one now, today.
They have some smaller body ones, which are much less expensive than the old school giant ones that first came on the scene years ago.
The Boss Stitch, what is it, strap shot? That's the one to buy. That's because it's got a finish nailer housing instead of a framing nailer housing. It's a fantastic tool, and they're not that expensive. It's like $200, I want to say. Mark wanted to alert us to his new tool purchase. He says, I picked up a really neat tool that Klein Tools came out with, the iOS Thermal Imager. It attaches to my phone. It comes in Android versions and iOS. And I did a quick energy audit on my house. One of the problem areas is the back side where there's an addition. It has a 312 pitch with no attic space and open soffits. Air just flows up through the soffit vent between the rafters over the top plate and bleeds into the house. I'd like to seal the opening above the top plate. How would you approach this? I attached a picture of one of the floor joists in the basement for reference. This one doesn't have a very big gap, but others are worse. So what do you think about dealing with this, vented soffit that blows right into the rest of his house?
It's taken me a long time to visualize this.
That was the thing I was having trouble with. It's
Existing
like, what is,
condition.
yeah.
So do you
What's
think
the confusion?
Well, he has a standard vented roof assembly, right? So is he saying that the insulation does not go out far enough to the face of the exterior wall where the soffit starts?
My interpretation is that he has a sloping ceiling with drywall on the undersides of the rafters and probably some kind of fibrous insulation in the cavity, and then a vented airspace above the insulation that connects to this soffit. So, of course, the insulation is doing absolutely nothing because we have no air barrier, right?
Right.
It's a common situation, but not one with a good solution.
We did a second story addition on a house in Madison recently, and we did have to open up the roof of the existing house where we weren't putting the second story. And we did do a lot of work because of an energy audit to stop something similar to this from happening. And I think it was a combination of air sealing materials and spray foam.
I think you got to pull down the ceiling and spray foam it or dense pack it. This probably shouldn't be a vented assembly because it makes the insulation do nothing.
If you're going to go to that route, can you do anything to block up the soffits? Take your soffit material down and keep your work to the exterior as opposed to the interior?
And then how would you insulate it, Ian?
Well, you'd have to be able to get into the cavity from the soffit on the outside.
Okay.
I think you could dense pack it that way, working toward the exterior, and then put blocking or cut and cobble foam into that rafter cavity to seal it off.
It's a hard one to know what to do without seeing it,
and without a budget.
Right.
Because this could get very expensive. But I'm sure it's a huge energy hit on the whole house, because if these rafter cavities communicate with other framing cavities, that air is not stopping in the ceiling. It's moving all the way through the house.
That's why I was wondering if just blocking the soffit, venting off, doing that inexpensively could get them part of the way there.
And you're not worried about making this an unvented assembly with potentially not enough fibrous insulation?
Yeah, that, again, without really knowing the existing condition, it's hard to know what to do there. But I think you're right. It is, who knows where it's all connecting to in the rest of the house, with it being an addition and the 312 roof. How much venting is that really taking from those soffits anyway?
It's not enough pitch, right, to be effective typically.
Yeah.
So, Ian, you would just block the soffit vents and see what happens?
I'd be tempted to do that, but again, without seeing the total existing condition, that's a little tough to just go for.
And it's like, is the fix, if that causes any other issues, more expensive than the full fix at the beginning?
Yeah, what kind of unintended consequences are you going to cook up trying to fix this problem?
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine how many people have this conversation after listening to us? How many unintended consequences are you going to cook up? It's hard to know what to do in this kind of situation, but
I think Mark's got to send us the thermal imaging. He kind of buried the lead there with his new thermal camera, but didn't send us any of the fun stuff.
Yeah, you're right about that. Mark, please tell us more, and we'll try and figure out a better way to
let's get
address
some
your
exterior
situation.
shots and get part 2 of this question figured out.
If it were me, I would be tempted to get with Dave and get some of his paper-faced Polyiso and cut and cobble every single rafter cavity, just because that's how I roll. Maybe those guys can work together on their insulation projects. I think that would be kind of cool.
And I guess that's what I was getting at with, can you just block the space between the rafters without any other intended consequences? But with it being a 312, it's not really wind washing the insulation away, right? Or do you think he could be getting enough through there to push the fibrous insulation back? And what he actually has is more of an uninsulated roof assembly.
That's what I would think. You know, the insulation that's in there is likely doing zero. And you just have this a huge air leak that could be making its way through the entire home, given the right roofing geometry on the rest of the place. Well, you know, it's heartening to hear all the nice things people say about the podcast, but I'm left wanting on some of our answers.
We're not closing on a strong one here, Mark, with your second question. You got to help us out.
Jeff, you have the opportunity to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. What should we do with this question?
I'm going to go back to Rob Yeagood's answer from back in the day. I need more information.
Fair enough. Mark, we'd love to help more. Take some pictures, send them along, and if you could show us how these spaces, this roof space communicates with the rest of the building, I think that would help us come up with a good solution and know better what to do. And I'm gonna, punt here and say that a good energy audit would maybe be money well spent. A few $100 to have a solution that's more definitive than ours.
If you're thinking about other tools that connect to your phone, a little inspection camera might illuminate what's actually going on up in this cavity too.
You get to see all the raccoons and squirrels that are living up there too, looking back at you.
You might get too much information, but they're just as fun as thermal imagers.
I want to remind folks about the podcast after show coming up for All Access members. If you're not yet an All Access member, please do that. It helps us keep the lights on, and you'll get some questionable content and podcast related.
More questionable advice coming ahead.
And what are we going to talk about, Ian? You want to remind folks?
We're going to talk about my Shed Mahal project that I'm considering undertaking.
Sounds great.
Looking
well,
forward to it.
unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Ian, Andrew, and Jeff for joining us. And thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com. And please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Keep craft alive. Keep your building air sealed.